The security cameras in Central Station's main waiting hall recorded everything that afternoon, except what mattered most. Alessandro Esposito moved through the terminal like a shadow in expensive tailoring. At 38, he had mastered the art of disappearing in crowds. He expected the usual theater of public spaces, stressed travelers, crying children, announcements echoing off vaulted ceilings. His attention belonged to the encrypted files glowing on his laptop screen, the kind of business that required focus even in chaos. Then he noticed the woman on the bench beside him. 70. Maybe older. Grey hair pulled back, severe and practical. A cervical neck brace wrapped around her throat like she'd survived something recent. Dark glasses covering her eyes. A black leather purse clutched against her chest. She sat perfectly still, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. She was blind, clearly injured, completely unremarkable. Alessandro barely registered her presence before returning to his screen. His security detail had eyes on every entrance. His technology tracked threats before they materialized. He was protected by the invisible architecture of the digital age. He was blind to everything that mattered. The old woman shifted. Not much, just a slight turn of her head in his direction. Then, with the precision of a clockwork mechanism, she raised her right hand. 2 fingers extended, pressed them against her own temple. Her thumb lifted like a hammer, cocking back. A perfect mime of execution. Her expression never changed behind those dark glasses. She held the gesture for exactly 2 seconds, her hand steady as stone, so facing him like she could see straight through to his soul. Alessandro's instincts screamed before his conscious mind caught up. He threw himself sideways as the world exploded into splinters and screaming. Alessandro Esposito didn't believe in guardian angels. He believed in leverage, in reading the angles no one else saw, in the cold mathematics of violence that kept him alive in a world built on betrayal. At 38, he had learned to trust his network of informants, his digital surveillance, his carefully constructed empire of ones and zeros that predicted threats before they breathed. He had never learned to trust a blind woman who could see what he could not. But in the half-second between her signal and the bullet that shattered the air where his head had been, Alessandro understood something fundamental had shifted. His sophisticated systems were useless against analog death. His screens couldn't stop lead, and the frail, injured woman beside him, the one society had trained him to overlook, had just saved his life with nothing but sound, instinct, and 2 fingers pressed to her temple. The question that would haunt him wasn't how she knew. It was why she chose to warn him at all. As we are about to begin, comment where you are listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. The bullet arrived before the sound. Alessandro's shoulder hit the wooden bench as glass exploded above him, the departure board shattering into 1,000 glittering teeth. His laptop clattered to the floor. Screams erupted like a flock of startled birds, high and discordant, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling of Central Station. He rolled, a muscle memory overriding thought, his hand already reaching for the Beretta holstered at the small of his back. His mind catalogued threats with mechanical efficiency: trajectory of fire, angle of approach, nearest cover, exit routes. The shot had come from behind him. Close, maybe 15 feet. Professional positioning, amateur execution, because he was still alive. The old woman hadn't moved. She sat exactly as she had before, spine straight, head tilted at that strange listening angle, her hand now resting calmly back on her purse. Around her, the station descended into beautiful chaos. Travelers threw themselves to the floor. A mother grabbed her child and sprinted toward the exit. A businessman in a grey suit froze like a deer, briefcase raised uselessly as a shield. But Florence, he didn't know her name yet, but he would, remained an island of unnatural stillness in a sea of panic. Alessandro's eyes snapped to where the shot originated. A man in a black jacket was already moving, shoving through the crowd with the efficient brutality of someone who knew exactly how many seconds he had before security converged. Mid-30s, athletic build, professional haircut. Not a face Alessandro recognized, but the type was familiar enough. Clean. Expensive. The kind of killer who bought his suits on the same street as his targets. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second across the chaos. The hitman's expression shifted. Surprise, then calculation, then something darker. His hand moved inside his jacket. Alessandro saw the motion and knew he had maybe 2 seconds before this became a massacre. The station was packed, civilians everywhere. His security detail was scattered across 3 entrances, too far to matter. He did the only thing that made sense in a world that had stopped making sense 30 seconds ago. He grabbed the old woman. "Move," he said, his voice low and urgent as he hauled her to her feet. She weighed almost nothing, bird-boned and fragile under his hands. The neck brace made her movement stiff, mechanical. But she didn't resist, didn't cry out. Just adjusted her grip on her purse and let him pull her toward the nearest corridor. Another shot cracked through the air. Marble chips exploded from the column beside Alessandro's head. He felt the sting of stone fragments against his cheek, tasted copper and adrenaline. The crowd screaming reached a new pitch. Someone triggered a fire alarm. The station's ancient bell system began its deep, rhythmic clanging. Perfect cover. Alessandro pulled Florence into the shadowed mouth of a service corridor, his body instinctively shielding hers from the angle of fire. His mind raced through the geometry of the situation. The hitman had hesitated on that second shot. Not because of bad aim. The first round had been inches from perfect. He'd hesitated because Alessandro had put the old woman between them, which meant she wasn't collateral damage. She was the reason for the hesitation. She was leverage. "Who are you?" Alessandro demanded, his back pressed against the cool tile wall, his eyes scanning the corridor for threats. His free hand still gripped the Beretta, safety off, finger resting along the frame. Professional discipline even as his pulse hammered in his throat. Florence turned her face toward him. Behind the dark glasses, he couldn't read her expression, but something in the set of her jaw suggested she was far calmer than she had any right to be. "Someone who just saved your life," she said. Her voice was surprisingly strong, touched with an accent he couldn't quite place. European, refined, with edges worn smooth by decades. "And if you want to keep it, we need to leave, now." In the main hall, he heard boots, heavy, coordinated, moving with purpose. Not security. They would be shouting commands, establishing perimeter. These were hunters. Plural. Alessandro's jaw tightened. This wasn't a single assassin making a desperate play. This was coordinated. Planned. Someone had positioned Florence next to him specifically. Someone knew he would be at this bench, at this time, focused on his screen like the arrogant fool he was. But someone had used a blind 70-year-old woman as bait, and she had saved him anyway. "Can you run?" he asked. Behind her dark glasses, he thought he saw the ghost of a smile. "Can you?" she replied. Alessandro grabbed her hand and ran. The service corridor spat them out into the station's lower concourse, a concrete artery lined with shuttered shops and fluorescent lights that flickered like dying stars. Alessandro's grip on Florence's hand was firm but careful, mindful of her age, her injury, the absurdity of dragging a blind woman through a kill zone at a dead sprint. Except she wasn't stumbling, wasn't panicking. She moved with him like she could see every step, her free hand trailing along the wall for orientation, her breathing controlled despite the pace. Behind them, the heavy boots gained ground, their rhythm mechanical and relentless. Alessandro pulled her left into a connecting passage that led toward the eastern parking structure. His mental map of the station unfolded with perfect clarity. He'd studied every exit, every blind spot, every choke point the day his network flagged this location as vulnerable. Preparation had always been his religion. Today it was keeping him alive. The first shot came as they rounded the corner, punching into the concrete wall 6 inches from Alessandro's shoulder. Stone dust bloomed in the air. He jerked Florence closer, putting himself between her and the angle of fire, his body making decisions his conscious mind was still processing. The second shot didn't come. Alessandro risked a glance back. 2 men now, both in dark tactical wear that could pass for private security in the chaos. And the lead gunman had a clear sight line, maybe 25 feet, professional stance, proper grip. Alessandro was exposed, Florence even more so. But the barrel didn't crack again. The gunman's jaw was tight with frustration. His partner barked something sharp in what sounded like Russian. The lead man shook his head, adjusted his aim fractionally, then lowered it again with visible disgust. They were trying to angle around Florence. Alessandro's mind clicked through the implications with cold precision. They wanted her alive, needed her alive, or at least intact enough for whatever purpose she served, which meant as long as he kept her close, kept her between himself and the bullets, they couldn't take the shot they wanted. She wasn't just bait. She was his shield. The realization tasted like ash and necessity, and he'd built his empire on hard choices, on understanding that survival demanded calculations that kept priests awake at night, but using a 70-year-old blind woman as body armor carved a new depth in the moral architecture he'd long since stopped examining. "They won't shoot you," he said, pulling her into the mouth of a stairwell that led down to the rail platforms. His voice was flat, stating facts without judgment. "You're valuable to them." "I know," Florence replied, her breath barely labored despite the exertion. "That's why I'm still breathing. And so are you." The stairwell was narrow, concrete walls pressing close. Alessandro took the steps 2 at a time, Florence keeping pace with surprising agility, despite the neck brace that locked her head at a rigid angle. Above them, the boots hit the landing, and a radio crackled, more hunters coordinating. This was bigger than 2 gunmen. This was an operation. At the platform level, Alessandro pulled Florence toward the tracks. A regional train sat idle, doors open, maybe 90 seconds from departure according to the display board. Passengers milled near the entrance, oblivious to the violence unfolding 2 floors above them. Normal people with normal problems, checking tickets and watches and phones. He envied them their ignorance. "Train," Alessandro said, already moving. "Now." They slipped through the doors just as the first gunman emerged from the stairwell. Alessandro positioned himself near the window, Florence beside him, his hand still wrapped around hers. Through the glass he watched the gunman scan the platform, radio to his mouth, eyes searching. The hunter's gaze landed on Alessandro. Recognition flared. The man started forward. The train doors hissed closed. For one perfect second, Alessandro and the gunman stared at each other through a pane of reinforced glass. The man's hand moved toward his jacket. Alessandro's fingers tightened on the beretta still hidden beneath his own coat. The mathematics of violence played out in both their eyes. Then the train lurched forward. The gunman's face twisted in frustration. He slammed a palm against the accelerating train, his lips forming words Alessandro didn't need to hear to understand. The platform began to slide away, the hunter receding into the industrial blur of the station's guts. Alessandro finally allowed himself to breathe. Florence settled into the seat across from him, what adjusting her purse in her lap, with the careful precision of someone who'd never quite lost her dignity, despite being hunted through a train station like an animal. She turned her face toward him, and even through the dark glasses, he felt the weight of her attention. "You used me as a shield," she said. Not an accusation, just a statement of fact. Alessandro met her blind gaze without flinching. "Yes." "Smart," Florence said, and something that might have been approval touched her voice. "You'll need to be smarter still if you want to live through tomorrow." The train carried them 3 stops before Alessandro decided it was compromised. He watched the passengers too carefully, catalogued every face that glanced their direction, measured the distance to exits with the obsessive precision of a man who'd survived by trusting nothing. When a businessman in a grey suit made eye contact twice, Alessandro pulled Florence to her feet. "We're leaving," he said quietly. They exited at a suburban platform where graffiti decorated concrete walls and the afternoon sun cut harsh shadows across empty benches. Alessandro's phone buzzed once, a coded alert from his security team. The station was locked down. Police were asking questions. His name hadn't surfaced yet, but it would. He powered the phone off and removed the battery. Digital breadcrumbs were luxuries he could no longer afford. His car was parked 2 blocks away in a private garage he maintained under a shell corporation's name. A black Mercedes S-Class, armored, windows tinted to opacity, engine modified for performance that had nothing to do with fuel efficiency. He guided Florence toward it with a hand on her elbow, his eyes scanning rooftops, parked vehicles, anywhere a patient man with a rifle might wait. The garage was empty. No ambush, no surveillance he could detect. Small mercies in a day that had abandoned mercy entirely. He opened the passenger door and helped Florence inside. She moved carefully, the neck brace forcing her to turn her entire upper body to navigate the seat. For the first time, he noticed how the brace's foam padding was stained darker on one side. Old blood, maybe, or new blood that had dried slowly. Alessandro circled to the driver's side, started the engine, and pulled into traffic with the measured calm of someone who knew that panic killed more efficiently than bullets. "Where are we going?" Florence asked. Her hands rested on her purse, fingers interlaced. To posture perfect, despite everything. "Somewhere they won't expect," Alessandro replied, merging onto the highway that curved away from the city center. In the rearview mirror, he watched for tails. 3 cars back, a dark SUV matched his speed too precisely. He changed lanes. The SUV changed lanes. His jaw tightened. Alessandro accelerated smoothly, the Mercedes's engine responding with the quiet power of expensive German engineering. The SUV accelerated too. No more pretense. He wove through traffic, not recklessly, but with the surgical precision of someone who understood that high-speed chases were won by keeping the other driver reactive instead of proactive. "Tell me who you are," he said, his voice level, despite the speedometer climbing past 140. "Tell me why they want you alive." Florence turned her head toward him, but the movement stiff and bird-like. Behind the dark glasses, her expression was unreadable. "My name is Florence," she said slowly, as if the words were heavy stones she had to lift one at a time. "Florence Martini. I'm 73 years old. I live in Genoa. I was visiting my daughter in Milan." The cadence was wrong, too careful, too measured, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized but didn't quite believe. "That's not what I asked," Alessandro said, cutting across 2 lanes to take an exit that appeared at the last second. The SUV tried to follow, but got boxed in by a semi-truck. Alessandro watched it recede in the mirror, buying them maybe 90 seconds before they adjusted. He turned onto a side road that led into an industrial park, all warehouses and chain-link fences. "I don't know what you want from me," Florence said. and now her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. Her hands tightened on her purse. I don't understand what's happening. Those men, the shooting. I just wanted to catch my train. I don't know anything. Alessandro glanced at her, his expression flat. She'd made a gesture with perfect timing that saved his life. She'd moved through a firefight without panic. She'd kept pace during a sprint that would have winded someone half her age. And now she was pretending to be a confused old woman who'd stumbled into danger by accident. "You're lying," he said simply. Florence's head tilted slightly, and for just a moment something shifted behind her careful facade. The tremor in her hands stilled, her breathing evened out. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight. "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps I'm in shock. Trauma does strange things to memory. I've heard that somewhere." "You saved my life," Alessandro said, taking another sharp turn into a narrow alley between two warehouses. "That signal you made, that wasn't random. That wasn't luck." "I don't remember making any signal," Florence replied. "I remember sitting, then noise, then you grabbed me. Everything else is confusion." She delivered the lie with the smooth competence of a professional. No hesitation, no tells, just a performance crafted to deflect and delay. Alessandro pulled the Mercedes into an abandoned loading dock and killed the engine. In the sudden silence, he turned to face her fully. "We're going to have a conversation," he said quietly. "And you're going to decide whether you want to keep pretending you're helpless or whether you want to explain why a blind woman can see bullets coming." Florence sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then, behind her dark glasses, he thought he saw the ghost of a smile. "Perhaps I'm waiting to see if you're worth the truth," she said. The safe house existed in the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business as a survival strategy. Crumbling facades, graffiti tags marking territory no one bothered to contest, windows covered with sheets instead of curtains. Alessandro had bought the building through a series of transactions so layered that tracing ownership would take forensic accountants months. He parked the Mercedes in the interior courtyard and guided Florence through a door that opened to 3 separate locks. But inside, the space contradicted its exterior completely. Renovated, clean, furnished with the spare efficiency of someone who understood that comfort was different from luxury. A leather sofa, a kitchenette with new appliances, windows fitted with bulletproof glass hidden behind those deceptive sheet curtains. Florence stood in the center of the room, her head moving in small increments, mapping the space through sound and air currents, and whatever other senses the blind developed to replace sight. "Sit," Alessandro said, gesturing toward the sofa before remembering the futility of the gesture. "The sofa is 3 steps directly in front of you." She moved toward it without hesitation, her hand trailing along the back before she settled into the cushions with a small sigh. The neck brace kept her posture rigid, her chin elevated at an angle that looked profoundly uncomfortable. Alessandro retrieved a first aid kit from the bathroom, along with clean towels and a bottle of water. When he returned, Florence had removed her dark glasses. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, the irises a washed-out blue that seemed to look through him rather than at him. Surgical scars marked the corners of both eyes, old procedures that hadn't worked. She was completely blind, which made what happened at the station impossible. He set the supplies on the coffee table and knelt in front of her, his movements careful and professional. The cut on her face had dried, but needed cleaning. The neck brace needed checking. "I'm going to remove your brace," he said. "Tell me if anything hurts." His fingers found the Velcro straps and released them slowly. Florence's breath hitched once, but she didn't pull away. When the brace came free, Angry bruising circled her throat like a necklace of violence. Finger marks. Someone had choked her, and recently. Alessandro's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his chest. He dampened a towel and cleaned the cut on her cheek with gentle efficiency. The wound wasn't deep, wouldn't scar, but the placement was deliberate, visible, meant to mark her as damaged goods. A warning to anyone who saw her. "You're good at this," Florence said quietly. "I've had practice," Alessandro replied, applying antiseptic. "Occupational necessity." He worked in silence for another minute, checking her pupils even though they couldn't respond to light, examining the bruising on her neck with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen worse. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and met her unfocused gaze. "Now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of every question he'd swallowed for the past hour. "Tell me how a blind woman saw a gun." Florence's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I didn't see it," she said. "I heard it." "Heard what?" "The gun being drawn, the safety clicking off. Those sounds don't carry through a crowded station." "No," Florence agreed, "but breathing does. Heartbeats do. The shift of weight that comes before violence does. You learn to listen when your eyes stop working. You learn to hear the things that sight makes people lazy about noticing." Alessandro studied her face, looking for deception. Her expression remained serene, almost peaceful, as if they were discussing weather instead of murder. "That's not enough," he said flatly. "Hearing someone breathe doesn't tell you they're pointing a gun at someone's head. Doesn't tell you the exact angle, the exact moment to signal. You couldn't have known with that precision." "Couldn't I?" Florence tilted her head, and the gesture reminded him of how she'd sat on that bench, listening to frequencies no one else registered. "The man behind you had heavy boots, military-grade, rubber soles with a specific tread pattern. He was standing perfectly still in a station full of movement. That's the first anomaly. His breathing was controlled. Tactical breathing. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out. That's the second. And then there was the sound." "What sound?" "Metal sliding against leather," Florence said. "Very quiet. Most people would miss it under the ambient noise. But I've heard that sound before. Many times. It's the sound of a pistol being drawn from a shoulder holster. The leather creaks in a specific way. Once you know it, you never forget it." Alessandro's jaw tightened. "You're telling me you reconstructed an entire threat based on footsteps and breathing patterns?" "I'm telling you I've been doing this since before you were born," Florence replied, and now her voice carried an edge of steel beneath the elderly timbre. "I'm telling you that the world is full of sounds that tell stories, and I'm very good at reading them." "Who are you really?" Alessandro asked. Florence reached for her water bottle, her fingers finding it without fumbling, and took a long drink before answering. "Someone who made enemies in a previous life," she said. "Someone those enemies finally found. Wasn't someone who chose to save you instead of letting you die." "Why?" Behind her clouded eyes, something flickered. Memory, calculation, or perhaps just exhaustion. "Because," Florence said softly, "you remind me of someone I used to be." Alessandro poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass and set it in Florence's hand, guiding her fingers around the tumbler. She accepted it with a nod of thanks, though she didn't drink immediately. Just held it, letting the warmth seep into her palms. He poured his own glass and settled into the chair across from her, the coffee table a demilitarized zone between them. Outside, evening was settling over the city, painting the bulletproof windows in shades of amber and shadow. "Talk," he said. Florence took a sip of whiskey, her expression shifting slightly at the quality. "Single malt," Expensive, or the kind of thing that didn't belong in a safe house, but did anyway, because Alessandro believed that if you were going to drink, you might as well drink well. I was 17 when they recruited me, she began, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone navigating old corridors in memory. 1970. The world was different then. The Cold War was hot in all the places that didn't make headlines, and Italy, beautiful, chaotic Italy, was a battlefield that most people didn't recognize as one. Alessandro said nothing, just listened. The whiskey sat untouched in his hand. I wasn't blind then, Florence continued. I had perfect vision, perfect hearing, perfect scores on every assessment they gave me. They called me Lucignolo, the nightingale, because I could hear things others couldn't. Intelligence work, Alessandro said, was not a question. Fosismi, Florence confirmed, naming Italy's former military intelligence agency. Later, some work with NATO partners. I was good at what I did. Very good. I could sit in a cafe and listen to a conversation 3 tables away while traffic roared past. Could identify a person by their footsteps from 50 meters. Could tell you what kind of gun someone carried by the way their jacket hung. She paused, taking another sip. They called it hyperacusis at first. Enhanced auditory sensitivity. But it was more than that. It was training layered on natural ability, layered on necessity. You learn fast when your life depends on hearing the safety click off before the trigger pulls. What happened to your eyes? Alessandro asked. Glaucoma, Florence said simply. Genetic, progressive, irreversible. I started losing my sight in my 40s. By 50, I was legally blind. By 55, completely dark. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass. They retired me, of course. What use is an intelligence operative who can't see? But you kept the skills. The skills deepened, Florence corrected. When one sense dies, the others don't just compensate. They evolve. I hear layers now that I couldn't when sight distracted me. I can tell you that the man at the station was carrying a CZ-75, Czechoslovakian manufacture, probably bought on the grey market in Prague or Warsaw. The slide has a distinctive sound when it cycles, higher pitched than a Beretta, lower than a Glock. Once you've heard it, you don't forget. Alessandro leaned forward slightly. And the boots? Lower Zephyr GTX, Florence said without hesitation. Mid-height tactical boots. The rubber compound they use for the sole has a specific density. When someone walks, it compresses and rebounds with a frequency of about 220 hertz. Military contractors love them. Police tactical units, private security. The man following me had been wearing them for at least 6 months. The wear pattern in his gait told me that. Right boot slightly more worn than the left. He favors his right side, probably an old injury. She smiled, but there was no humor in it. He thought I was helpless. They all did. An old blind woman in a neck brace, shuffling through a train station. Easy to control, easy to position. They put me on that bench 3 hours before you arrived. Told me if I moved, if I made a sound, they'd kill my daughter. Showed me a photograph, not that I could see it, and described in detail what they'd do to her. Alessandro's grip tightened on his glass. So you were bait. I was bait, Florence agreed. They knew your patterns, knew you'd be at that bench at that time, focused on your laptop, blind to everything around you, knew you'd have security scattered through the station, but not close enough. The plan was simple. I sit next to you. You ignore me because I'm invisible. And when you're perfectly positioned, the shooter takes you from behind. Clean, professional, untraceable back to whoever paid for it. But you warned me. But I warned you, Florence echoed. Because somewhere between them choking me and threatening my daughter and positioning me like a prop in their theater, I made a choice. I decided that I'd been someone's tool long enough. She turned her clouded eyes toward him, and despite their sightlessness, Alessandro felt the weight of her gaze. "I heard you before you sat down," she said. "Your footsteps. Confident, controlled, aware. I heard the way you breathed, tactical patterns just like the shooter. I heard the quality of your clothes, expensive leather shoes on marble, and I knew. You were a wolf, just like the man behind you, just like the men who threatened my daughter. So why save me?" Florence smiled again, and this time there was something fierce in it. "Because wolves," she said, "are better at protecting sheep than sheep ever will be, and I needed a wolf who owed me a debt." The whiskey was gone. Alessandro poured them both another measure. The bottle's weight lighter than it had been an hour ago. The safe house had grown darker as they talked, shadows pooling in corners where the single lamp couldn't reach. He hadn't turned on more lights. Somehow the darkness seemed appropriate for the kind of truths they were excavating. Florence shifted on the sofa, her hand unconsciously touching the bruises on her throat. The gesture was brief, almost reflexive, like worrying a wound to confirm it still hurt. "You said they threatened your daughter," Alessandro said, returning to his chair. "But you didn't mention who they are." "Because it's complicated," Florence replied, her voice quieter now, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "And because some betrayals are harder to name than others." Alessandro waited. He'd learned patience in the same brutal school that taught him violence. Sometimes silence extracted more than questions. Florence took a long breath, her fingers finding the whiskey glass again. "The man at the station," she began. "The one with the CZ-75 and the lower boots. I know his walk better than I know my own. I've listened to those footsteps for 26 years. Listened to him learn to crawl, then walk, then run. Listened to him grow from a boy into a man." Alessandro's expression didn't change, but something cold crystallized in his understanding. "Family," he said. "My grandson," Florence confirmed, and the words fell like stones into still water. "Marco Santini, my daughter Elena's son, 26 years old, smart, charming, angry, always so angry, even as a child." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the weight of old regrets. "Elena married a bastard, Lorenzo Santini. Charming at first, violent later. He beat her for 7 years before she found the courage to leave. By then, Marco was 12 and had learned that men solve problems with their fists, that love looks like control, that weakness deserves punishment." Alessandro listened without interrupting, recognizing the architecture of broken families. He'd seen it before, that specific kind of damage that replicated itself across generations like a genetic disease. "I tried to help," Florence said, "paid for therapy, enrolled him in schools, used my old connections to get him opportunities. But you can't save someone who doesn't want saving." By 18, he'd found his way into private security. By 20, he was working for people who asked fewer questions about his methods. By 24, he'd become the kind of man his father was, just with better training and worse employers. "And now he's trying to kill you," Alessandro said. "Not me," Florence corrected. "You. I'm just the bait, the leverage, the tool they needed to get close to you." She turned her face toward the window, toward sounds Alessandro couldn't isolate from the ambient noise of the city. Traffic, voices, the distant wail of sirens that meant nothing or everything depending on context. "They came for me 3 days ago," she said. "Broke into my apartment in Genoa. Marco was there, but he wasn't leading. There were others. Russians, I think, based on the language. They spoke Italian with Marco, but Russian among themselves. The accent was Moscow, maybe St. Petersburg. What old money, not new. The kind of people who've been playing these games since before the wall fell. What did they want? Information first, Florence said. They knew about my past. Knew I'd worked intelligence. Asked me questions about operations from 30 years ago. Networks that don't exist anymore. People who are long dead. I told them I didn't remember. That I was old and blind and useless. She smiled without humor. Marco told them I was lying. Said his grandmother remembered everything. That her memory was the one thing that never failed, even when her body did. He was proud when he said it, like he was bragging about a particularly useful trait in a dog he owned. Alessandro's jaw tightened fractionally, the only outward sign of the cold anger building in his chest. When I wouldn't talk, what they hurt me, Florence continued matter-of-factly, touching her throat again. Marco watched. Didn't participate, but didn't stop it either. Then they explained the new arrangement. I would help them with a job in Milan. I would sit where they told me to sit. I would do nothing. And if I cooperated, Elena would live. If I didn't, they'd send me pieces of her until I changed my mind. They showed you proof she was alive? They put her on the phone, Florence said. 30 seconds. She was crying. Told me she was sorry, that she didn't know Marco was involved until it was too late. Her voice cracked slightly. My daughter apologized to me for her son's choices. The silence that followed was heavy with the specific weight of family violence, the kind that carved wounds too deep for healing. So you went to Milan, Alessandro said. So I went to Milan. I sat on that bench for 3 hours waiting for you, listening to Marco position himself behind you, listening to him check his weapon, listening to him breathe the way I taught him to breathe when he was young and afraid of the dark. Florence's blind eyes found Alessandro with uncanny precision. And I chose you over him, she said quietly. I chose a stranger over my own blood. Tell me, Mr. Esposito, was I wrong? Alessandro stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghosting across the bulletproof glass. Behind him, Florence sat perfectly still, waiting for his answer to a question that had no good response. Was she wrong to save him? Philosophy was a luxury neither of them could afford. Your daughter, he said, turning back to face her. Where are they holding her? I don't know, Florence admitted, though they were careful. No addresses, no landmarks mentioned when I could hear. But Elena lives in Bergamo. I'd guess somewhere within 30 kilometers, close enough to use as leverage, far enough to avoid accidental discovery. Alessandro's mind was already moving through the logistics, cataloguing resources and calculating odds. He pulled out his phone, then stopped, the device heavy in his hand. His thumb hovered over the power button. What is it? Florence asked, her head tilting at the angle that meant she was reading him through sound alone. My security network, Alessandro said slowly, the realization crystallizing into cold certainty. They knew where I'd be, exactly where, exactly when. That information doesn't exist in public databases. It exists in encrypted calendars, in location data, in digital communications between me and my team. He set the phone on the table like it was radioactive. Someone's inside my system, he continued, his voice flat with controlled anger. Deep enough to access movement schedules, deep enough to predict patterns. Your grandson and his Russian friends, they didn't just get lucky. They had my entire digital footprint mapped. Florence's expression darkened. Marco always was good with computers, Even as a child, he could crack passwords, bypass parental controls. I thought it was cleverness. Turns out it was just preparation for this. Alessandro stared at the phone, at the laptop bag he'd dropped by the door, at the entire architecture of technological advantage he'd built his empire on, all of it potentially compromised, all of it feeding information to people who wanted him dead. "I need to shut it down," he said. "All of it. Every device, every account, every digital connection. Go completely dark." "Can you operate without it?" Florence asked. "In my experience, men like you build themselves into their systems. Take away the technology and they're just flesh and anger." "I was flesh and anger before I had technology," Alessandro replied. "I'll remember how." He spent the next 20 minutes systematically destroying his digital presence. Phone disassembled, SIM card snapped, battery destroyed, laptop hard drive removed and placed in a microwave he'd modified specifically for this purpose. Electromagnetic pulses turned data into noise. He sent one final encrypted message to his second-in-command, a man he'd known since childhood, someone who'd earned trust through blood and time. Compromised, going dark, hold position. Then he severed that connection too. When he finished, the safe house felt different, quieter, like stepping back 50 years into a world where information moved at the speed of shoe leather and whispered conversations. Florence smiled as if she could sense the shift. "Welcome to my world," she said. "How does it feel?" "Vulnerable," Alessandro admitted, settling back into his chair. "But cleaner somehow. They can't track what doesn't broadcast." "So what now?" Florence asked. "You're dark. They still have my daughter. They still want you dead. And they have resources we don't." Alessandro poured the last of the whiskey into their glasses, dividing it evenly. "Now we use the only advantage that matters," he said. "They think you're helpless. They think I'm dependent on technology. They think they've won because they control the digital battlefield." "But we're analog," Florence finished, understanding blooming in her voice. "We're analog," Alessandro confirmed. "Your grandson knows computers. But does he know the old ways? Does he know how to run an operation without leaving electronic traces? Do his Russian employers?" Florence considered this, her fingers drumming a slow rhythm on her whiskey glass. "Marco's generation grew up with phones in their hands," she said thoughtfully. "Everything documented, everything connected. They've never had to operate in true silence. The Russians, though, the older ones, the ones who sound like Moscow money, they'd remember. They lived through times when a wrong word in the wrong ear meant disappearing." "Then we split the difference," Alessandro said. "But we plan an operation that looks analog but baits them with just enough digital signal to draw them in. A trap designed for people who think they've already won." He leaned forward, his expression hardening into the focused intensity that had kept him alive in a business where most men died young. "Tell me everything you remember about where they took you. Every sound, every smell, every detail your other senses caught that your eyes couldn't see. Tell me about Marco's patterns, his habits, the way he thinks when he's planning violence." Florence's smile turned sharp as broken glass. "And then? And then we teach your grandson something they apparently didn't cover in his training," Alessandro said, raising his glass in a toast that felt more like a declaration of war. "What we teach him that the most dangerous predators are the ones who learned to hunt before technology told them how." Florence raised her own glass, the whiskey catching lamplight. "To going analog," she said. "To going analog," Alessandro echoed. They drank, and in the silence that followed, they began to plan. The warehouse squatted on the edge of the industrial district like a monument to obsolescence. 3 stories of corrugated steel and broken windows, abandoned when the manufacturing jobs fled to cheaper countries. Alessandro had acquired it 2 years ago through the same shell corporation that owned the safe house, never imagining he'd use it as a killing floor. But then, he'd never imagined partnering with a blind, 73-year-old woman to hunt the people hunting him either. The trap was elegant in its simplicity, as Alessandro had used a burner phone to make a single call to a number he knew was compromised, a low-level associate whose loyalty had always been negotiable. He'd mentioned the warehouse, mentioned needing to meet a contact there, mentioned the address twice, as if trying to be discreet while being perfectly obvious. Then he'd waited. Now, positioned on the 3rd floor in complete darkness, he pressed the small earpiece deeper into his ear canal. Florence's voice came through, calm and steady, despite being 2 blocks away in a stolen van with equipment cobbled together from consumer electronics and old intelligence tradecraft. 3 vehicles approaching from the east, she said, her tone conversational, like she was narrating a nature documentary. 2 sedans, 1 panel van. I can hear the diesel engine on the van. Mercedes Sprinter, are probably armored. They're driving slow, cautious. Alessandro said nothing, just listened. Speaking would compromise his position, create sound in the cavernous space that their ears might catch. They've stopped, Florence continued. Doors opening. I count 8 distinct footfall patterns, 2 staying with the vehicles, 6 advancing toward the building. Your grandson is among them. I'd recognize his gait anywhere. Alessandro's jaw tightened in the darkness. He'd spent 3 days preparing this space, every light bulb removed or destroyed, every window covered with blackout material, emergency exits welded shut, except for 1 route he'd left deliberately open, a path he could navigate blind if necessary. Because in 5 minutes, everyone in this warehouse would be operating blind. Except him. They're entering the ground floor, Florence said. Tactical formation, professional spacing. They have flashlights, LED, high-powered. I can hear the slight electronic hum the circuits make. Alessandro moved silently to the stairwell, his rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the concrete. He'd practiced this route 100 times in the dark, memorized every step, every obstacle, every irregularity in the floor. They're splitting up, Florence narrated. 4 moving toward the office area where you said you'd be meeting your contact. 2 breaking off to clear the perimeter. They're being thorough. Someone trained them well. The irony wasn't lost on Alessandro. He was using the woman who'd taught her grandson to survive to help kill him. He reached the electrical panel he'd modified, his fingers finding the master breaker by touch alone. He'd wired it with a remote trigger, but he wanted to be certain, wanted his hand on the switch when the world went dark. They've reached the office, Florence said, checking the space. Someone speaking Russian, angry tone. They know it's empty. They know it's a trap. Alessandro smiled in the darkness. Smart of them, Florence continued, but not smart enough. They're regrouping on the ground floor. Marco is saying something. Wait. A pause. Alessandro's finger rested on the breaker. He knows you're here, Florence said, her voice shifting slightly. He's telling the others that you wouldn't set a trap you weren't present for, that you're too arrogant to let someone else pull the trigger. The word stung because it was accurate. Their Florence had called it 3 days ago when they'd planned this. She'd said Marco would use Alessandro's pride against him because it's what she would have done. They're moving to search the upper floors, Florence said. Lights sweeping. They're expecting an ambush, but thinking you'll use the high ground advantage. Thinking you'll... Alessandro threw the breaker. The warehouse plunged into a darkness, so complete it was almost physical. The LED flashlights died instantly. He'd run every circuit in the building through the same panel. Battery-powered lights winked out, as if God had simply decided photons should cease to exist. For exactly 3 seconds, there was perfect silence. Then panic bloomed like flame. Voices erupted in Russian and Italian, confused and sharp. Footsteps stumbled. Professional spacing dissolving into chaos as men who'd trained to fight in the light discovered they couldn't remember where their teammates were standing. "Two on the ground floor near the eastern wall," Florence said, her voice steady in Alessandro's ear. "Moving erratically. One just collided with a support beam. The other is backing toward what he thinks is the exit, but is actually a dead end." Alessandro moved down the stairs like water, each step precise and silent. He'd counted them so many times he could navigate them in his sleep. His hand found the Beretta, the weight familiar and comforting. "Marco is on the second floor," Florence continued. "Northeast corner. He stopped moving. Smart boy. He knows movement creates sound. He's listening." Alessandro reached the second floor landing. The darkness was absolute. He could hear breathing now, harsh and controlled, maybe 20 feet away. "He's raising his weapon," Florence said. "Sweeping arc, left to right. He's guessing." Alessandro dropped to a crouch, changing his sound profile, his elevation. "He heard you move," Florence warned. "Adjusting aim, down. He's aiming low now." The shot cracked through the darkness, muzzle flash blooming like a brief sun. Alessandro was already rolling, using the flash to map Marco's position, his brain calculating angle and distance in the split second of illumination. "You missed," Florence said calmly, speaking to her grandson through Alessandro's ears. "You always pull left when you panic. I taught you better." Another shot. Wild. Desperate. Alessandro fired twice. Professional double tap, aimed at the sound of breathing and the memory of where the muzzle flash had originated. A body hit the floor. Chapter 9. The villa sat in the hills above Lake Como, where morning light turned water into hammered silver, and the air smelled of jasmine and old money. Alessandro had bought it 6 years ago, under a name that had no connection to his empire. A place so clean it didn't appear in any database that mattered. Now it belonged to Florence. He found her in the garden, sitting beneath a pergola heavy with wisteria. She wore white linen instead of the stained hoodie from the train station, her neck finally free of the brace, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. A younger woman sat beside her, Elena, rescued from a basement in Bergamo 3 days after the warehouse went dark. The mother and daughter looked up as Alessandro approached, though only one pair of eyes could actually see him. "Mr. Esposito," Florence said, her voice warm with recognition. "I heard your car 10 minutes ago. You drive too fast on these mountain roads." "Old habits," Alessandro replied, stopping a respectful distance away. Elena studied him with the wary gratitude of someone who'd been saved by a monster and wasn't entirely sure what that made her. "Elena," Florence said gently, "would you give us a moment?" The younger woman nodded, squeezed her mother's hand, and disappeared into the villa. Alessandro watched her go, noting the careful way she moved, the residual trauma visible in her posture. "She'll heal," Florence said, reading his silence. "The body recovers faster than the mind, but both recover eventually. What I've learned that lesson more times than I care to count." Alessandro moved closer, settling into the chair Elena had vacated. The garden was meticulously maintained, each plant chosen for texture and scent rather than visual appeal. A blind woman's paradise. "The Russians?" Florence asked. "Gone," Alessandro said simply. "The organization that hired them received a message explaining why pursuing this matter further would be unwise. They were receptive to the argument." And the men from the warehouse? The survivors are spreading the story. A blind woman and a mafia boss walked into a trap and the trap died instead. It's the kind of legend that makes people think twice about accepting contracts with my name on them. Florence smiled, but there was sorrow in it. "Marco?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "Quick," Alessandro said, which was the kindest truth he could offer. "He didn't suffer." Florence's hands tightened briefly on the arms of her chair, then relaxed. She nodded once, accepting the information the way someone accepts news of a terminal diagnosis. Inevitable, painful, but not unexpected. "I raised him wrong," she said quietly. "Or perhaps I raised him in a world that was already broken and expected different results. Either way, he was my blood, and I sent a stranger to kill him." "You sent him to kill himself," Alessandro corrected gently. "You just gave him a stage to do it on." The choices were always his. They sat in silence for a while, listening to bird song and the distant sound of Eleanor moving through the villa, rebuilding her life one careful step at a time. Finally, Alessandro stood. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, thick with documents and keys. "The villa is yours," he said. "Completely. Title transferred through enough legal layers that no one will ever connect it to me or to what happened. Elena can live here as long as she wants. There's an account, enough money that neither of you will ever have to worry about rent or food or medical care." Florence turned her face toward him, and despite her blindness, he felt truly seen for the first time in years. "You're paying a debt," she said, "the old way, blood and honor." "I'm acknowledging a teacher," Alessandro replied. "You taught me something I'd forgotten, that the most sophisticated weapon is useless if you can't see the person standing next to you. That sometimes survival means trusting the one sense no amount of technology can replace." He knelt in front of her chair, a position of supplication that would have shocked anyone who knew him. Alessandro Esposito knelt for no one, bowed to no authority, acknowledged no power greater than his own. But he knelt now. He took Florence's weathered hand in both of his, feeling the paper-thin skin, the delicate bones beneath, and with the formal reverence usually reserved for the heads of families, for the true powers in his world, he pressed his lips to her knuckles. "Donna Florence," he said quietly, using the feminine form of Don, a title of respect that carried weight in the world he inhabited. "You saved my life. You taught me to see in the dark. You reminded me that power without wisdom is just noise waiting to be silenced." Florence's fingers curled around his hand, returning the gesture with surprising strength. "And you, Alessandro Esposito, proved that wolves can still have honor. That's a rarer thing than you imagine." He stood, releasing her hand slowly. "If you ever need anything," he said, "anything at all, I know where to find you," Florence finished. "Or more accurately, I know how to listen until you find me." Alessandro smiled, genuine and unrehearsed, an expression his face had almost forgotten how to make. As he walked back to his car, he heard Florence call after him. "Alessandro." He turned. "Drive slower on the mountain roads," she said. "The ones who survive aren't always the fastest, or sometimes they're just the ones who knew when to listen." He raised his hand in acknowledgement and drove away, taking the curves with uncharacteristic care. Behind him, in a garden designed for senses that mattered more than sight, a blind woman sat in the sunlight and smiled. Sometimes the people who save us are the ones we never see coming. Sometimes strength wears the face of fragility. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone dismisses, until it's too late to correct the mistake. If this story reminded you to look beyond the surface, to listen to the voices that often go unheard, then share it. Like it. Comment below with the person in your life who taught you to see what others miss. Subscribe for more stories about the unlikely heroes who change everything. Because the truth is simple. We're all blind to something. The question is whether we're humble enough to let someone else be our eyes.